Good evening. Good evening and welcome to tonight's special event, which is the 15th annual Biard Lecture of the Center for Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics. Hi, I'm John Beacom. I'm the director of the center, which is also called CCAPP. CCAPP has an ambitious mission, and that mission includes finding the largest objects in the universe, galaxies and clusters of galaxies, and also the smallest objects in the universe, the constituents of elementary particles and the constituents of atoms. And most importantly, figuring out how those are connected. But that's not all of our mission. A second part of our mission is to share how we learn those things with our students and postdocs to train the next generation of scientists. And the third part is to share that with the public, because we believe that science unshared is like science undiscovered. It's not enough for us to find these things. Everybody deserves to have the same sense of wonder that we do about the majesty of the universe. A crucial part of our outreach mission is made possible by a generous gift from Captain Forrest R. Biard and named in honor of his parents. There's a fascinating story about Captain Biard, who was in the Navy and also helped crack codes during World War II. And I encourage you to check out the CCAPP webpage and read about him. Tonight, we have a very distinguished visitor. It's Sean Carroll from the Johns Hopkins University and the Santa Fe Institute. At Johns Hopkins, Sean is the Homewood Professor of Natural Philosophy, and that fancy title indicates that he has a home in both physics and astronomy and philosophy, reflecting his very broad interests. So Sean is renowned internationally not only as a researcher and not only as a mentor, and not only as an author of textbooks and popular books, but also for his ability to communicate science to the wider public and to help inspire the next generations of scientists. And for many of us, he's an old friend, and so we are delighted to have him here tonight. And we're also delighted to have all of you here tonight, and we greatly appreciate your interest in all of this. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thanks, John. Thanks to all of you. I presume you're out there. I can't see anybody with the lights in my eyes, but I hear it's very chilly outside. I appreciate you coming to enjoy a little bit of a lecture on the universe. It's not the usual lecture on the universe. There's a standard toolbox or bag of tricks in this field that we call cosmology and particle physics. And I'm going off the reservation a little bit in talking about this topic of complexity. So you might be asking, what does this have to do with cosmology? Why is this the subject of the lecture? I mean, part of the answer is I'm writing a book on it. And someday you'll be able to buy the book. I'm writing a 3-volume set. It worked very well for J.R.R. Tolkien and others, the trilogy format. This is called The Biggest Ideas in the Universe. And there's volume 1 on classical physics, volume 2 on quantum physics, and volume 3, which I'm writing right now, is on complexity and emergence. And so it is in my head right now. That's part of the reason why I wanted to talk about it. But the other reason is that there is a very real relationship to cosmology and to the evolution of the universe. The relationship comes in the form of attention. Now, attention is an interesting word. It means that something, it isn't a direct contradiction, but it seems that it doesn't fit quite right. It doesn't quite we don't quite understand how it fits into the bigger picture. And the tension is between two very obvious facts about the universe. One obvious fact is called the Second Law of Thermodynamics. That's the statement that entropy increases over time in a closed, isolated system. Entropy is a way that we have of talking about the disorderliness, the randomness of a system. You can scramble an egg. It is hard to unscramble the egg. You can take cream and coffee that are separate. That's a kind of an organized, low entropy configuration. You can mix them together, and entropy goes up. It's very hard to unmix them. There's a natural tendency of the universe for disorderliness to increase. But at the same time, we know that right here on Earth, things are not completely disorderly. From moment to moment, they might seem a little disorderly in our lives, but there's a high degree of complexity and organization in not only individual biological organisms, but in the ecosystem as a whole, in other things, in the environment as a whole, the internet, the economy. Complex systems have come into existence over the course of the evolution of the universe. How do we understand the origin of these complex systems, given that the second law of thermodynamics says that disorderliness increases over time? Now, none of this is a direct contradiction, like I said. There's a worry in certain circles. How is it possible to be compatible with the second law and to have life appear and flourish here on Earth? The answer is that the Earth is not a closed system. Okay? The second law of thermodynamics says that in an isolated, closed system, and one that you leave alone, you do not mess with, entropy will generally increase. If you take a deck of cards and shuffle them, they will go from orderly to disorderly. But it's possible to put the deck of cards back in order. That is not against the laws of physics because the cards don't do it by themselves. Likewise, our Earth's biosphere is not all by itself in the universe. We get light from the sun, and it turns out we get light in a very particular low entropy form. We get visible light from the sun, and then we give back to the universe almost exactly the same amount of energy that we get from the sun. But we give it in a different form. We give it in the form of infrared light. An infrared photon, a particle of light, is less energy, longer wavelength than the visible light we get from the sun. You run the numbers. For every 1 photon of light we get from the sun, we give back 20 photons. We have increased the entropy of the universe by a factor of 20 when it comes to that amount of energy. So the total action of the Earth is to greatly increase the entropy of the universe. We are entirely compatible with the second law of thermodynamics. But that doesn't explain why complexity and orderliness have arisen in exactly the ways that they have. So that's our question for tonight. I'm told that the purpose of the lecture is about astrophysics and cosmology and particle physics, so I will talk about those things. Here's the universe. Here is cosmology. You'll see many plots of the history of the universe. They have the unfortunate tendency to end at the present day. They show you the past and the present, but we actually have a pretty good handle on the future. Not as good, because you can't take pictures of the future, but we have a predictive theory that tells us what's going to happen. So in our best model of the universe today, we start at some completely non-understood moment, the Big Bang moment, about 14 billion years ago. I actually like to start just a teensy bit after the Big Bang, where even though we don't understand everything, we have some plausible ideas about what might be going on. We have this idea of inflationary cosmology, where the universe was very, very smooth and expanded at a tremendous rate. So the thing to think about the early universe is hot, dense, and smooth. And then over time, it expands and it cools. Here we actually have data. We have direct images of a moment about 400,000 years after the Big Bang, when the universe cooled off enough that atoms could recombine and form. And that basically made the universe transparent, and we can take a picture of it. This little elliptical image right there is an image of the cosmic microwave background radiation. So at this moment, the universe is a little bit cooler and a little bit less smooth than it was at very early times. There are slight ripples. The little differences in color you see on the image represent slight differences in density from point to point in the universe. And then you get to today, where we are in this image. This is an image of galaxies in the universe. Today, the universe is rather lumpy. It is no longer smooth. There's planets some places, no planets other places, galaxies in some locations, empty intergalactic space in others. And in the future, what's going to happen? Those stars are going to stop burning. They're going to fall into black holes eventually. We'll enter a long period where most of the stuff of the universe is either black holes or the occasional rock or planet or white dwarf star. Even those will eventually fall into the black holes. So for a very long time, the universe will be empty space plus a few black holes. But Stephen Hawking in the 1970s showed us that even black holes don't last forever. They eventually evaporate away into a thin gruel of particles. The last black hole will disappear about 10 to the 100 years from now. 1 Google years from now, as we used to be able to say before the search engine got invented. And then we're nothing left but empty space. In 1998, we discovered that the universe is accelerating, that it's not only expanding, but it's expanding faster and faster. We attribute this to something called dark energy, an intrinsic energy that lives in empty space itself. And if that continues on, and we have no reason why it wouldn't, that means the universe will expand forever. So we have 14 billion years to the past. That sounds like a lot, but we have infinity years to the future. It's never going to end, according to this simple picture that we have some reason to give credence to. It will be a cold, empty eternity. It's a slightly unbalanced universe, but here we are in the middle of that story. Now let's take that story and compare it to the entropy story. The idea of entropy goes back to the early 1800s, but it was in the late 1800s where we really figured it out. People like Ludwig Boltzmann, the Austrian physicist, he explained that if you just believe in atoms, which was not an obvious thing to do in the 1870s, physicists in particular were not convinced that atoms existed. But Boltzmann says, if you grant me atoms, I can explain what entropy is. It's basically a way of counting. He says, look, when I look at the cream in the coffee, let's say that the cream and coffee are both made of molecules, but I don't see the molecules with my eyes, right? I see the sort of gross, observable, macroscopic features of the cream and the coffee. There are many different arrangements of molecules that would look the same to me. I can exchange molecules of cream or molecules of coffee with each other. It would look the same, this picture. And so he says entropy is a way of counting. For you math nerds in the audience, it's the logarithm of the number of arrangements that would look macroscopically the same. So on the left, when the cream and coffee are separated, I could interchange cream molecules with each other, but if I started moving one into the coffee, I would begin to notice, right? So there's a relatively small number of arrangements that look that way. On the right, where everything is mixed together, there are many, many more arrangements of molecules that look that way. So entropy is just a way of counting the number of ways we can rearrange molecules and atoms and particles to look the same macroscopically. And that understanding provides an instant understanding of why entropy tends to increase. If entropy is just a way of counting how many ways there are to look like something, you will naturally go from low entropy to high entropy simply because there are more ways to be high entropy. So think of this graph as showing you all the different ways I can arrange the constituents of a system, the molecules in a cup of cream and coffee, for example. Some of those arrangements are going to be very macroscopically precise, and those will be low entropy. The large regions here correspond to macroscopic configurations where there's many different ways to look more or less the same. And here's Boltzmann's formula. It's on his tombstone. I always like to tell my graduate students, what is the formula that will be on your tombstone someday? It's a good thing to aim for if you're a young physicist. The entropy is some constant, Boltzmann's constant, times the logarithm of the number of states that look the same. So if you start in a low entropy region and just wander off into the space of all configurations of stuff, it is very natural that entropy will go up. There's more ways to be high entropy than low entropy. Now, you are allowed to ask, as Boltzmann did, why did the universe start in a low entropy state? Nobody knows the answer to that one. I could give a talk about it, but that would be a different talk. In the end, the answer is nobody knows the answer to that one. So for today, we're taking it for granted that near the Big Bang, the entropy was low. So we can revisit our picture of the universe and think about it in entropy terms. When the universe was very small near the Big Bang, we don't exactly know what was going on, as I said. But for simple, very plausible models, the entropy corresponding to our observable universe is something like 10 to the power 10, a 1 followed by 10 zeros, 10 billion, okay? And as the universe expands, that entropy goes up. compatible with the second law of thermodynamics. By the time of the cosmic microwave background, the entropy of our observable universe is something like 10 to the power 88, which is a very big number. 10 to the 10 is good old economics-sized number, but 10 to the 88th, you need cosmology to get into that. By today, you've made a much lumpier universe, and the entropy has gone up. It is something like 10 to the power 101, but it's still not as high as it can be. In the future, when you make these black holes, when those black holes eventually evaporate, when you approach the period of dark, desolate, cold emptiness, we will eventually equilibrate into a maximum entropy state. And the entropy of our observable universe then will be something like 10 to the power 122. So 10 to the 10 is less than 10 to the 88th, is less than 10 to the 101, is less than 10 to the 122. Entropy is going up. The numbers are increasing. Good. Can we understand the evolution of complexity, of complex structures over the course of this evolution? There have been many attempts to do this. Here's a famous one from Stephen Wolfram. Uses the idea of cellular automata. Now, Wolfram is a computer scientist, not a physicist, so in his diagrams, time goes from top to bottom. Very, very strange, difficult for me to understand. For physicists, time goes from bottom to top or from left to right. But this image is what you get on your computer, and you can easily do this on your computer at home. You have a certain rule that says I have a string of black squares and white squares, and I give you a rule that updates that string into the next sequence. So I start at the top, and I update it to the next one, the next one, the next one. And what you can see is that starting from a single black dot on the top level, you get this very intricate pattern. It's kind of unpredictable, right? On the left side of the diagram, it's kind of a regular, predictable pattern. But on the right, there's this weird melange of different triangles of different sizes, what you might not have expected from the simple starting point. So Wolfram suggests that a very, very simple update rule, a very, very simple model for what you might think of as the laws of physics, can lead to complexity from very simple beginnings. This is great. It is also not at all how the laws of physics as we know them actually work. The laws of physics as we know them do not create complexity out of nothing. We want to ask the question, can the laws of physics as we know them lead to complexity from some reasonable initial conditions? And we know a lot about the answer to that question, even though the full story remains to be told. One interesting feature is, according to, again, our best models, I'm going to stop saying that over and over again. You should just take for granted that what I'm doing is explaining to you our favorite models of the universe. They might be wrong. That's always true in science, right? They might be wrong, and that would be very exciting if they're wrong. This is our current best picture. So in the early universe, we think, as we said, the early universe was very, very low entropy, and there was this idea called inflation, where the universe was expanding at an enormous rate, okay? Now, according to the rules of quantum mechanics, which I'm not going to go into details, that's a different talk that we could give, but the basic idea is that what you think of as a particle that has a position, in quantum mechanics is described as a superposition of many, many different positions, or a spinning particle could be in a superposition of spinning clockwise and counterclockwise. And then you observe the particle and you never see the superposition. This is the mystery of quantum mechanics. An electron is in a superposition of many places until you look at it and then it's in a definite place. And that's not just true for electrons, that's true for any quantum system. So the universe, according to our favorite theories right now, at very early times was essentially featureless. There was a quantum mechanical state the universe was in where everything was literally exactly the same from point to point. But what happens is, and again, this is complicated quantum theology involved here, but essentially the universe measures itself. It collapses from a superposition of many different things that adds up to smoothness to a very particular specificity. So on the left, there's just an ellipse that I drew in PowerPoint. On the right, there's the actual data from the Planck satellite of the tiny ripples in density that were there at the early universe. So you imagine that the picture on the left can be thought of as a superposition of many, many different random specific fluctuations of density up and down, but we find ourselves in one specific one. Okay, we have one universe with one pattern of density at early times, and once that's there, gravity takes over. You don't need quantum mechanics anymore. If you have a region of space where there's slightly more density than average, that will pull other matter toward it. So here is a simulation of the structure in the universe. This is just a bunch of dots distributed reasonably at early times. I'm going to click the button and turn on gravity, and what you're going to see is what we call the formation of large-scale structure in the universe. Gravity turns up the contrast knob. It takes those tiny primordial seeds and turns them into stars and planets and galaxies. And just by looking at this picture, you go, you know what? This picture seems maybe a little bit more complex than this picture. This seems pretty simple, right? The kind of smooth thing. And then when you let it go, it looks more complicated to me. Can we make that a little more quantitative? Can we do some science to that? And the answer is yes, we can. So the answer to the question that we're going to just sort of investigate here is that even though entropy increases as the universe expands, complexity first increases and then will fade away. It's a different behavior than entropy. And the reason is they're two different things, okay? Entropy, as we said, counts the number of configurations that basically look similar to us. Whereas complexity, at least one version of one avatar, one manifestation of complexity, is how much information you need to specify the macroscopically observable configuration. So look at the cream and the coffee. On the left, we said low entropy, right? It's delicately arranged. Cream on top, coffee on bottom. It's also very simple. Cream on top, coffee on bottom. We just explained the whole thing. On the right, high entropy, everything is mixed up. It is also simple. Everything is mixed up. That's all you need to know. It's in between where you see tendrils of cream and coffee mixing together in some fractal turbulent pattern. That's when there seems to be complexity there. And indeed, if you took photographs of this and saved them on your phone or your computer, the JPEG file of the image on the left would be smaller than the one of the image in the middle, and the one on the right would also be smaller. It takes less file size to tell you what's going on the left or the right than it does in the middle. You can just say white on top, black on bottom, etc. Whereas in the middle, you got to tell me exactly where those little swirls are. So entropy goes up in the closed system that we're thinking of, in this case, the universe. But complexity first goes up and then goes down. And indeed, it's not just cups of coffee. The universe itself is the same way. That early state is low entropy, but very simple. It's perfectly smooth, hot, and dense. The final state is very high entropy, but also very simple, cold, desolate, empty. It's in the middle. It's now, when the universe is complex, when there are specific stars and planets and galaxies and living organisms here. You can take a tiny bit of solace cosmically in thinking that you live in the exciting part of the universe's history. Now, everyone always wants to know, are we literally at the most exciting part? Is it going to get a little bit more exciting? We do not know the answer to that. Just to put a little bit of data, feeling here, we are scientists after all, here is one slightly depressing piece of news. I have two depressing pieces of news. The last one will be the most depressing, but this is mildly depressing. This is the rate of star formation in the universe, in weird astronomers' units where the present day is on the left and the past is on the right. You see it peaked at a redshift of about 2, which means about 10 billion years ago, about 4 billion years after the Big Bang. as far as we know, and we have pretty high confidence in this, of all the stars that will ever be created in the history of the universe, most of them have already been created. There was a burst of star formation in the first few billion years after the Big Bang, and now we're kind of using up the fuel that we've had. So this is a tiny bit of evidence that complexity has come and maybe is beginning in some ways to fade away. There's all sorts of different levels of complexity going on, but the Bang Bang era of the universe, where the skies were lighting up with stars, is beginning to fade out. And what is the relationship to entropy of this? It is actually a little bit subtle. Only medium entropy configurations have the capacity of being complex. Because if you're in a small entropy configuration, there's not that many things that can be going on, okay? Once you tell me which low entropy configuration you're in, that's it. Likewise, when you're in a high entropy configuration, there's many different ways to arrange the atoms, but they all kind of look smooth and boring, right? The cream and the coffee are all mixed together. The air molecules in this room are all evenly distributed. High entropy, but boring. It's medium entropy states where maybe you could be very simple, but you have the capacity of being complex. So the potentiality opens up along the way from low entropy to high for complexity to come into existence. So we have to ask the question, does it? When does it? What are the conditions under which the journey from low entropy to high entropy gives us a complex universe? So the thing that is easy to do is ask, how much complexity could there possibly be in low entropy, medium entropy, and high entropy states? You naturally get a sort of maximum complexity envelope. This is a plot of how much complexity there can be versus entropy. Low entropy on the left, high entropy on the right. So basically, early times on the left, later times on the right. And the question is, what does the actual universe do? Or what does some subsystem of the universe do? It could generate a lot of complexity on the way or not much complexity on the way. That's what we're here to investigate. And we actually have done a little bit of science to this, a very, very little bit. We made a computer simulation of cream mixing into coffee. Okay? In fact, we had to make multiple computer simulations because different predictions or different models of behavior give us different answers. So the coffee automaton is a little picture, a little grid with white squares on the top, black squares on the bottom, and we let them mix together. And we ask, does the image, if you sort of step back and squint your eyes a little bit, does that image develop complex behavior? So I'll be very honest about the scientific method here. We wrote a paper. We suggested two different models of coffee and cream dynamics, one of which is the individual molecules of cream and coffee just move separately and independently, wandering randomly through the coffee cup. The other is that when there's a cream molecule and a coffee molecule next to each other, they have a certain probability of flipping, okay, locally interacting. Movement of the cream and the coffee. Neither one of these develops any complexity at all. This is very depressing, but this is what science is like. Science is mostly depressing. We just keep the fun parts for you. The depressing parts happen along the way. We had this hypothesis, didn't really work. That's okay. You go back to the drawing board and say, okay, I clearly left something out. This is how you learn things in science. You have ideas, they don't work out. So we invented a new model. We call it the tectonic model because it's kind of like tectonic plates shifting. Rather than one cream and coffee molecule flipping, we coherently moved a bunch of cream and a bunch of coffee, randomly chose how much to move and which direction to move it in. And indeed, in the dynamics of that model, you clearly see complex behavior developing. And even more indeed, you can plot it, you can measure it, you can calculate how complex the configuration is. So over here you have time running from left to right, complexity running from bottom to top, You see the diffusive model where the cream and coffee molecules move independently. That's the red model at the bottom. It's just simple the whole way. The fact that that curve never goes up is telling you complexity never develops. The blue model, where there's some coherence, right, where there's some correlation with what's moving at different steps, that becomes complex before it fades away. I'm convinced this is a super important clue as to how and why complexity develops in the real world. This picture of the coffee and cream isn't in any way realistic, but it suggests that there's this correlated behavior, this coherent force, this long-range interaction is somehow playing an important role in the development of complexity. So that's all I can do for you in terms of a down-to-earth simulation of a real model, but we can peer into the future. What are the next steps? I should say that the science of complexity is not very well developed. There's been an enormous amount written. I'm a part-time faculty member at the Santa Fe Institute in New Mexico, devoted to the study of complex systems. But complex systems are, guess what? Pretty complex. They come in a variety of different forms. So we're focusing in here on the question of what is the origin of that complexity in the physical universe. And one feature that we're beginning to take very seriously is that complexity does indeed come in a variety of different guises. And indeed, you can tell the story of the origin of complexity over time as an increasing level of sophistication in the complexity that we see. So all I've talked about so far is the top level here, what we call apparent complexity. It's literally the dumbest thing you can do. You have a picture of something. Does the picture look simple or does it look complex? We can measure that quantitatively, and that's what we were plotting on the previous slide. But you notice that, when you think about all of that image of large-scale structure forming, right, the different particles in the universe coming together to make galaxies, that can go on forever. You can become more and more complex. Whereas in the real universe, if stuff comes together, eventually it stops contracting because you make a star. Okay, here's a star. This is the sun. Actually, this is not a great picture of the sun for my purposes because it makes it look more complex than I want to emphasize. Most stars are actually pretty simple things. They're dense at the center, less dense at the outside. They're burning nuclear fuel. Stars are fusion reactors, right? Protons bumping into each other, making heavier elements. And the heat generated by those reactions are keeping the stars the size that they are. So there's a balance between the gravitational contraction and the nuclear push on the outside. So there's a sort of meta-stability, which is a way of saying it's stable for a temporary period of time. No stars last forever. Ultimately, they use up their nuclear fuel and go away. But you've made something interesting. You've made a star because of the way the laws of physics say that early universe should evolve. Now, still the star is pretty simple. Every layer of the star looks more or less the same. You can get more complex structures with what we call modular complexity, where different parts of the system are playing different roles. So this is Jupiter and its atmosphere. You notice the famous red spot there that has been there for hundreds of years. It's something going on with the underlying topography plus the atmospheric dynamics of Jupiter. The red spot is different from the rest of the planet. In our Earth, you have continents and you have oceans and you have lakes and you have rivers. They're all playing slightly different roles. You have a new kind of complexity that has come to pass. Of course, the big leap that we would like to understand is the origin of life. Like rivers and lakes and red spots are kind of complex, but a bacterium has them all beat, okay? So you can think of a bacterium as something that collects information from the outside world and uses it to survive. If you just had this particular arrangement of atoms making up a bacterium, but it was put in interstellar space or whatever, it would die, right? The bacterium is able to find nutrients and keep itself alive through doing this. That's a kind of responsive complexity that uses information to stay alive. And then, of course, at the top, at the peak of the hierarchy, we have ourselves. That's where we're always going to end up. Our brains not only look around and decide, oh, there's the food, we should go there. We can create images of possibilities. We human beings, and arguably to a lesser extent other species, have the capacity to imagine futures that may or may not happen and use that imaginative capacity to make plans and make our lives hopefully more fruitful and productive. So that idea of modeling the future of the world is a yet more sophisticated use of information. And the word information is playing the crucial role here. The different levels of sophistication and complexity basically represent more and more sophisticated ways to use information to maintain the stability of an increasingly intricate system. So I need to talk a little bit about information and how it works, because, bless their hearts, scientists don't use words to mean one thing. They'll use the same word to mean very different things. And information in the context of entropy and things like that, like we've been talking with, is very related to, information is very related to entropy, but not in a consistent way. It depends on the scientist you're talking to. So in the top right, just for fun, I put the title of a paper that I'm an author on, where we literally just sat down and tried to clear the air by saying there's at least 4 different things we mean when scientists talk about information. I'll only tell you 2 of them. One of them comes from this guy, Claude Shannon, was a brilliant scientist in the mid-20th century, worked for Bell Labs, so very down to earth. They were interested in sending signals over transatlantic cables. They knew that there was noise in the system, and they wanted to know what is the best way to send a reliable signal across the ocean. So Shannon realized that if you want to send information and you have a certain set of symbols you're receiving, right? Words or letters or numbers or whatever, what kind of signals convey a lot of information? And the answer is surprising signals. So if someone says to you, the sun rose in the east this morning, you will not be that impressed. You probably already knew that the sun rises in the east. If someone says to you, the sun rose in the west this morning, if that person was actually trustworthy, even though they've only changed a couple of letters, right, from east to west, suddenly you've received really, really informative signals from that statement. So what Shannon realized is that when you have a probability distribution of different signals you can receive, the most information-packed that your message can be is when every single symbol you receive is equally likely or equally unlikely. If it's 99.99% of the time you get one signal and 0.0001% time you get the other one, most of your signals are not very informative. So in terms of a probability distribution, this is the probability of getting different messages, and there's 2 different ideas, 2 different sort of alphabets or symbolic languages you can use. When all the probability is concentrated in one small set of messages, that is low entropy, right? It's like all the cream in coffee are concentrated in very particular places. And in Shannon's sense, it is low information. You don't learn a lot from those signals. Whereas if it's a high entropy alphabet that is being used, you get a lot of information from every single word. So to an engineer or to a communication scientist or a statistician, they will tell you high entropy means high information. Physicists will tell you high entropy means low information. How can they be both saying compatible things? Well, the answer is they're talking about a different notion of information. If you're Boltzmann and you say, I know the macroscopic state of a system, so I know, oh, all the cream is on top, all the coffee's on the bottom. But I don't know the microscopic state. I don't know exactly where the molecules are. Telling me that the system is in a low entropy configuration gives me a lot of information because there aren't that many low entropy states to be in. I've told you a lot about the possible configurations of the system. If I tell you it's in a high entropy state, that means there are many different systems it could be in. I've given you very little information about which precise state the system is in. So to engineers, the words high entropy are associated with lots of information. To physicists, the words low entropy are associated with lots of information. I tell you this merely because I know that some of you hang out on the wrong street corners and will hear other people talking about entropy and information. I want you to be warned that we use them in these very different ways. Today, we're being physicists, okay? So when we know that a system is in a low entropy state, that gives us a lot of information. It gives us a lot of leverage on knowing what the particular microscopic state of the system is. And guess what? The early universe was in a very low entropy state. That gives us a lot of information. And in the future, it'll be a very high entropy state. That information that we had will be lost. So you can think of the evolution of the universe and the increasing entropy of the universe. Every time you mix cream into coffee, you are irreversibly destroying some of the information in the universe. The information we have left over from the Big Bang is the ultimate resource that we have, and we are using it up. Don't try to conserve the information. Don't feel bad. Our very lives rely on the ability to use up this resource. So what we're doing right now is, again, trying to put some quantitative meat on these bones. We can talk about the available information in the system. It's the difference between the maximum entropy the system could have and the actual medium size or low entropy it doesn't have. And this is what the universe gradually uses up. So the story of increasing complexity is a story of making use of the information resource that the early universe has given us. And from now on, I'm just going to, with the rest of the talk, just wave my hands pretty wildly to give you a flavor for how this might work, even though the full quantitative theory is not understood. Think about a box of gas. This is what we think about as professional physicists. Box of gas, atoms bumping into each other randomly. And let's just say we have two different types of atoms. These are the red balls and the blue balls here in the box, okay? Now, there's a lot of configurations that you can imagine. Every different position that the atoms could be in, every different velocity that the atoms have. There's a lot of different ways you can arrange that box of gas. But it doesn't mean a lot, right? If they're all sort of randomly moving, there's a lot of different possible configurations, but you don't learn a lot by looking at the box of gas. If instead you let these atoms bump into each other and stick together, now there's a much smaller number of configurations. There are many fewer ways to be stuck together than to be freely moving. But you can also now store information, right? Now I can ask questions like, what is the sequence? Blue, red, red, blue, right? It almost sounds like an alphabet, like a word, like a code giving me information. And if the atoms stay stuck together, that is a way of storing information. This is a transition physically from a sort of analog world to a digital world, one in which lots of things can happen, to one in which fewer things can happen, but the things that can happen can be useful to us in a brand new way. And this way of thinking is very old. A famous example of it comes from Erwin Schrödinger, who famously helped found quantum mechanics, but later in life he wrote a little book which was hugely influential called simply, What is Life? He's writing this in the 1940s, so we didn't know about DNA at the time, and Schrödinger just thinks about the problem like a physicist. He says, look, I know that there are organisms and they have offspring, and there's this thing called heredity. There has to be some way for the information of the particular organisms who are the parents to be carried down informatically to their children, to be altered, to be sure, but nevertheless some stable way of keeping information from moment to moment. And in a way, that's a little surprising, because biological organisms are kind of messy, kind of warm, wet, squishy things. Where is that information located, says Schrödinger? Well, he helped invent quantum mechanics. So he knows, like, how can you build something out of atoms that will store information in a useful way? He knew about things called crystals, right? A crystal, for example, of salt, a salt crystal, has exactly the same molecule lined up over and over again. It's very orderly, it's very stable. A salt crystal can survive a long time, but it doesn't actually convey a lot of information because it's just salt, it's just NaCl, sodium chloride over and over again. No information there. So Schrödinger said, I bet what you need to carry genetic information is an aperiodic crystal. That is to say, a set of atoms that are stuck together, but in a way where they don't have to be the same thing over and over again, where there can be like some kind of alphabet of symbols that can be arranged in all sorts of different configurations. And of course, this book was read by Francis Crick, who along with James Watson then went and decoded how information was stored in DNA, in our genetic code. There is indeed an alphabet, GATC, 4 different base units, nucleic acids, that can be arranged in different orders to contain the information that leads to our biological specificity in our bodies over time. So he made the prediction, in some sense, on the basis of very general physical principles, and it turns out to be true. So we want to go a step backwards. We want to ask, what is it about physics, about the laws of physics, that lets this happen? There is a problem no one would ever notice. Only I am the only person in the universe who cares about this problem. Conservation of energy in the creation of molecules. So we said, in order to store information, we want to take those bouncing atoms and stick them together. That is a well-known process. It's called chemistry, right? You can take, for example, here's a famous example of a molecule with 2 atoms, hydrogen and chlorine, making hydrogen chloride. So I have a hydrogen atom, a chlorine atom. They can stick together. Why? Because the electrons that are orbiting the nucleus of the atom can be shared between the 2 of them. So in a chemistry textbook, you will see a picture like this. This is probably more fun than most of your chemistry textbook illustrations, but the idea is 2 separate atoms come together. Now, why am I making a big deal of this? It's because the reason why hydrogen chloride is stable is because that combination, that molecule, has a little bit less energy than the individual atoms. If I have a hydrogen atom and a chlorine atom, separately I can measure their energies, bring them together to make the molecule. It has about 5 electron volts less of energy. The electron volt is a weird unit that physicists use to measure energy. So if you're super duper naive, you say, why would this reaction ever happen? One side has less energy than the other side. I thought energy was conserved. Is this a real problem? Should chemistry violate the laws of physics? No. But what you actually need is for that energy to be carried away. 5 electron volts of energy has to go somewhere. You need some kind of extra particle. It's not that hydrogen plus chlorine goes to hydrogen chloride. It has to be hydrogen plus chlorine goes to hydrogen chloride molecule plus some other energy carrying thing. And ideally, since you want many different ways for chemistry to happen, you want that energy carrying thing to have a very low mass and to interact noticeably with ordinary matter. I will not keep you in suspense any longer. There's a very well-known particle that has these properties. It is called the photon. The photon is the particle of light. Well, I already talked about photons coming from the sun. The real reaction is hydrogen plus chlorine goes to hydrogen chloride plus 2 photons. I'm really dwelling on this perfectly obvious, very, very commonplace thing because this fact enables the emergence of complexity in interesting ways in the history of the universe. Because complex structures, DNA, bacteria, whatever, they have a certain energy. They're very specific. Probably they're not random, right? Like these useful kinds of complexity like we have in biological organisms, if you took the same atoms in a person and randomly arrange them, it wouldn't make a person. It's unlikely to make a person that way, right? So if you think about the space of all possible ways to arrange atoms, very few of them are complex in this interesting, productive way. So here, imagine, again, I'm just drawing the space of all possible arrangements of some things, atoms or molecules or whatever. And if it weren't for photons, if it were just atoms bumping into each other, the total energy in the atoms would stay the same, very roughly speaking. And so you would move left to right. So I plotted it in a way that energy is going vertically. So energy is constant along any horizontal line, and you would expect if you started at some point, you would only be able to move horizontally because energy is conserved. And the little places where you can get interesting complex creatures might be at lower energies than what you have. But you can get there because of what is called dissipation in a physical system. In the evolution of real-world things, you can give off energy by emitting photons, and maybe, this is what we're trying to understand, this helps you find the metastable complex configurations that can use the information resource that the universe gives us to stay alive, to flourish even. So I was told I had to talk about particle physics in the talk. Well, the photon is a particle. The photon counts. And I really want to drive home the extreme good fortune we have to live in a universe where there are photons, okay? Why is that? Well, in order to be able to enable chemistry to happen, when you have one atom and another, or many, many atoms and many, many other atoms, you want to form them in all sorts of interesting configurations with all sorts of different energies, and you want to do that by giving off dissipated energy in the form of photons. It's really, really helpful if the photons can have any energy at all. And they can. Unlike an electron, for example, or a proton, electrons and protons have a minimum energy that they can possibly have because E equals mc squared. E equals mc squared is Einstein's famous formula that tells us the energy a particle has when it is at rest, when it is not moving. It's the minimum energy it can have. If the electron was the lightest particle in nature, you could never bring two atoms together unless the energy difference that you got by doing that was at least the mass of the electron, which is not true for any molecule that we know about in the universe. But photons, which have zero mass, they're massless particles, they can be created with as little or as much energy as you want. They are the perfect vehicle for carrying away the extra energy and allowing yourself to find the interesting complex configurations of matter, of atoms. Now, you also don't want the particle to be too strongly interacting, otherwise they literally stick to each other. There's another famous massless particle in nature, the gluon. The gluon is the force-carrying particle of the strong nuclear force. But you've never met a gluon in person because they interact so strongly that they are confined inside protons and neutrons. So that wouldn't do any good for carrying energy away. You can't carry away energy in a gluon. They can't escape. On the other hand, this is now three hands, you don't want the particle to interact too weakly either. The other famous massless particle in nature is the graviton, the particle of gravity. Gravity is important, keeps us here on the Earth, but individual gravitons are almost impossible to discover because they interact so weakly. If you depended on the emission of gravitons to do chemistry, chemistry would never happen in the universe. So my point of going through all of these features of photons is that they really are exactly correctly constructed to allow for complexity to come into existence over the history of the universe. And you know, you and I are complex systems. There's something called the Anthropic principle in cosmology, which says if you imagine different kinds of universes with different features, Intelligent creatures will only find themselves in parts of the universe that allow for the existence of intelligent creatures. I hereby claim that having photons around is absolutely necessary for the existence of intelligent creatures because their existence for the formation of complex structures more generally. Now, photons have the special properties they do because of symmetries in particle physics. There's probably much better reasons than this why photons actually exist, but just for fun, we can imagine photons exist because we are only in the part of the multiverse where photons actually happen. Okay, that was enough. I'm already, you have to get late in the talk. You get to let your hair down and have some fun. So let me talk about the last thing then. As far as we know, the most complex thing that naturally arises in the universe is indeed life, living organisms. As I mentioned, the existence of life is not in any contradiction with the second law of thermodynamics because the sun is a hot spot in a cold sky. We live in a very out of equilibrium, medium entropy environment where the low entropy photons from the sun give us the fuel to do metabolism, to chew our cud, to give talks, to build internets and nations and things like that. Life is not a substance that moves from place to place. It's a kind of process that is fueled by information, by the fact that the entropy of the light we get from the sun is so low energy, so low entropy. I once was reading a paper on the origin of life on my way to fly to a conference, and I'm on the airplane. I sit next to this guy, this guy sort of leans over, he looks at the paper. Sometimes this happens if you're a scientist on an airplane. And he goes, oh yeah, I know that paper. Well, we were going to a conference, so it was not completely random that there'd be another scientist. And he volunteered the following statement. He says, I can tell you the purpose of life. And now I'm a little bit worried because that's not a conversation you want to have over a long airplane ride. But he did surprise me with the next sentence. He says, the purpose of life is to hydrogenate carbon dioxide. Now, it turns out that this person was Michael Russell, who was a famous researcher in the origin of life. What he meant was this. In very plausible pictures of the early Earth, there was regions of the environment of the Earth that had an excess of carbon dioxide. And you go through the chemistry and math, and you realize that that is a way for the carbon atoms to be in a relatively low entropy configuration. It would be higher entropy. In other words, you would like to go to a configuration where you stripped off the oxygen atoms from the CO2 and replaced them with hydrogen to make methane, CH4. The problem is that there's no simple way to do that. Even though methane is higher entropy because it is lower energy and it gives off photons, higher entropy than carbon dioxide, all of the ways to journey from there involve steps where the entropy has to go down first. These are weird chemist units where entropy is high at the bottom and low at the top. Scientists, like I said, they cannot talk to each other, right? They barely speak the same language. Anyway, Russell's point was, it's not that entropy increasing is fighting against life or vice versa. The fact that entropy is increasing is enabled by life in certain circumstances. Russell took this idea. He said, in order to increase the entropy of the carbon in the CO2, you need a complex reaction network that forms the metabolic backbone that evolved into life. He thought about the chemistry and the geology of it, and he predicted the existence of these alkaline hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean. And after he made the prediction, they were found. This is the Lost City formation at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. It is plausible, we don't know, because we don't understand the origin of life, but it is plausible that life began not despite entropy increasing, but because it was a new way for entropy to increase. And indeed, we still use this today. We have bodies that keep themselves in pretty good repair because basically we are very much like Maxwell's demon. Maxwell's demon is a famous thought experiment, again from the 19th century. Maxwell said, well, what if I have a box of gas, but I have a little hole where if I let them High velocity molecules can go to one side and low velocity ones to go to the other side. And I imagine a little demon, now called Maxwell's demon, who lets all the high velocity stuff go one way and low velocity stuff go the other way without touching it, just putting a little barrier and pulling it up at the right time. So the demon isn't injecting energy into the system, but it is separating high temperature gas from low temperature gas and therefore lowering the entropy. It seems like the entropy is going down in the box, even though technically the demon isn't touching it in any way. The answer turns out to be this is perfectly allowed, but only because the demon needs a kind of fuel. The demon needs to live in a world where there's low entropy, high information resources that he can then dissipate into the environment. And our bodies are full of little Maxwell's demons maintaining the orderliness of our cells and organs. So we shouldn't feel that we are here despite the second law of thermodynamics. We are very literally here only because of the second law of thermodynamics. Now I can end on my other depressing piece of news. Could you imagine that we'll be here forever? Could you imagine from this picture that the complexity which is us could survive literally infinitely far into the future? There was a famous paper written in the 1970s by Freeman Dyson, a well-known physicist, who said, I can imagine living creatures existing and thinking literally for infinity years. And the trick is they keep thinking thoughts, but each thought takes longer and uses less energy. And he showed, using math, that even though there's an infinite number of thoughts, the total energy used in doing the thinking was finite, even if you kept an infinite number of thoughts going. So Dyson says, life could in principle last forever in an open universe. But he didn't know that we live in a universe that is not only expanding, but also accelerating. He didn't know that at the time. Once we know that the universe is accelerating, that means there is a maximum entropy. Dyson was worried about energy, but he didn't worry about entropy. It turns out that if there's a maximum entropy you can have in the universe, we're in trouble. Because thinking generates entropy. All of this existence of us interacting with the world, looking around, we're creating entropy, roughly 10 to the 20 bits per second in an ordinary human brain. So if you multiply that by our lifespan, you will generate about 10 to the power 29 bits of entropy in your life. Okay, call that a human life equivalent. It's a lot, but it's nowhere near the maximum entropy of the universe. But there is a maximum entropy of the universe, so we can't go on forever. History to date has had about 100 billion people in it, about 100 billion human life equivalents. The maximum entropy of the universe is about 10 to the 122. So we have room in the history of the universe for an upper limit of 10 to the 93 human life equivalents. I say human life equivalents because they might be robots or AIs, or the octopuses might take over someday, but there's only a finite amount of thinking that can be done in the history of our universe. It might be better to burn out, but eventually we will fade away. Sorry about that. The good news is that's very, very far in the future, and in the meantime, there's a lot of science to be done, and we're trying our best to do it. Physics, my field, has traditionally focused on the simplest possible systems to think about. The spherical cow. The joke is that a physicist is engaged to help a farmer increase the milk output, and the physicist first says, okay, imagine your cows are perfect spheres. That's how physicists think, by oversimplifying things. But the world is not that simple, and it's time that we start taking complexity seriously. Thank you very much.
So on behalf of the Center for Cosmology and Astroparticle Physics, we'd like to thank Dr. Carroll for his wonderful talk. And now we'd like to open the floor to questions. We have 2 microphones at the front. People can come forward to those. If somebody has a mobility issue, I can run out there with this microphone.
We can probably turn up the house lights also.
Yes, yeah, let's do that. Can we raise the house lights maybe to 50% or so? Yeah, go ahead, bud. Jump up.
It's an honor to see you again, Sean. My question is, if we ever have a neutrino detector that as using it as a satellite, what would we see before the CMB?
Oh, that's a good question. So I'm not the world's neutrino expert. We have the world's neutrino expert right here, by the way. Have you ever given one of these talks? All right. But I know enough to answer this question. The question is, what if we could do for the CMB what we're doing with the CMB, but with neutrinos rather than with photons? Because remember, as we said, photons have the nice feature that they do bump into matter occasionally. They do bump into atoms, and that's why we have the microwave background forming at a very particular moment in the history of the universe, the moment the universe became transparent. Now, neutrinos are not quite massless, but very, very low mass. They can travel very far, very fast, but they don't interact very strongly. So neutrinos were basically, the universe was transparent to neutrinos for many, many years before the microwave background formed, since seconds after the Big Bang. If we could map out the neutrino background to the precision that we mapped out the cosmic microwave background, we would learn what the universe was like a few seconds after the Big Bang. We're not going to do that. That's not going to happen. Neutrinos can be detected. They are detected, but you don't get very accurate pinpoint location of where they are in the sky for exactly the same reason they're hard to detect. The thing that makes them transparent in the early universe also makes it hard to build a telescope that generates, billions and billions of neutrinos across the sky. So certainly not in my lifetime is that going to happen. Sorry. I hope someone asks me a question where I can give like a really optimistic, uplifting answer at some point to this.
Let's jump to the other microphone.
Hello, thanks for the nice talk. How do you know the total entropy of the universe if we don't know the physical extent of the
Oh, yes. If you play the tape back, you will notice I never said the total entropy of the universe. I very clearly always said the total entropy of the observable universe. And specifically, I'm talking in the context of really taking seriously the idea that there is vacuum energy in the universe. There is what we call the cosmological constant, which pushes space apart. And just like in a black hole, you have a horizon that separates the inside of a black hole from the outside, and we imagine ourselves standing outside the horizon and imagining what's going on inside. When you live in a universe with a vacuum energy, there is a horizon around us. We are inside, and there's a region outside of which no signal can ever get to us, because the space in between us and them is expanding too fast. So if we have measured the amount of vacuum energy, which we think we have, then we make a very strong prediction for how big the observable universe can ever get to be, and it's a finite sized.
Okay, go ahead.
Hi. Thank you for the talk. I'm coming from information theory. I intuitively understand this notion of number of macrostates, microstates within a macrostate. I can even write the definition of entropy, and you differentiate. And if you can show that if things move from more to less, indeed the entropy tends to increase. Now we take that picture, that simple picture, and generalize it in every aspect of universe. For example, I love the example you gave, the HCl combined. Normally it wouldn't happen because I would tend to go to lower entropy, but the function of the photon, as you describe it, is to increase the entropy, not just release energy, but increase the entropy, and that's kind of the reason why that thing happens. But I cannot intuitively put a frame in my mind, how that kind of relates in a similar fashion as I can relate in my mind, why, like macro states, because there are so many microstates, there's a tendency for that to happen. How do you, in general, take that picture and generalize it to every aspect of, second law of thermodynamics, perhaps, so.
Well, I would like to know. That's a very good question. This is what we're trying to do. So what I've tried to do is sort of gesture toward what we kind of think about what is happening. This is an example, remember, of how by allowing a complex network to come into existence, namely a proto-cell, we have given the physical world a way to increase its entropy. And then the other example is, once these organisms exist, how do they persist and self-repair? Again, they rely on the low entropy environment that they're in, which they then use as a resource to increase it. So I do think that there is a coherent, sensible, general picture where the low entropy of the universe is a resource that we're using up. But the specific ways in which we're using it, this is not the language that is generally spoken by either complexity theorists or by origin of life researchers. So what we're doing here is, a small number of us, we're trying to marry together the perspectives of the physicist, the information theorist, and the biologist to come up with a coherent overall picture of why life comes into existence in the first place and why it persists. But we're not anywhere close to being done yet.
Let's jump to the next mic, but let's do shorter questions here and longer questions at the reception.
Okay. Okay. Hello. Well, first, I watched these series during the pandemic.
Oh, very good.
Yeah, I actually picked a good project for my modern physics class. So thank you for that. That's been waiting for 5 years. And my question is, so we talked about the complexity and entropy, but so like in a phase transition for like Ising model, we have the minimum energy, we want to have the ground state, but also in finite temperature, we want to increase entropy. But so why we use, instead of like minimum energy and like the trade-off between energy and entropy, why we're using complexity and entropy? Why we should use that? Thanks.
Yeah, of course, you're allowed to use whatever you want. It is much more, the subtext here is that physics very often can make progress just by saying, look, there's a landscape of possible energy values that you have depending on the configuration of matter, and what happens is things go to the bottom of the valley, and they sit there. If you literally roll a ball down a hill, it goes to the bottom and sit there. Why? Because it's radiating heat and energy into the universe. The word complexity never comes into the discussion there. But that's also not enough to describe biology, right? The physicists get a lot of mileage out of that, but we notice a feature of the universe, which is that the universe is more than balls rolling down hills. Schrödinger, elsewhere in The Origin of Life, in What is Life, he literally tried to answer the question, what is life? And the answer he suggests is, life is a system that keeps on moving and doing things long after it should have stopped. So if you imagine a goldfish in a bowl without any food, it will die quickly. But you put a little flakes of food in there, that fish can live a long time. A fish is a machine for turning fish food into extended life. That is not something we can understand purely by looking for the minimum of some potential and rolling down to it. We need to think harder.
Okay, let's probably take 2 more questions, but please keep them short. Go ahead.
Hi, thank you for talking. And my question is, in one page of your presentation, you mentioned something called stable complexity island. And why does it exist? And why does it existing? And why is just right there for?
I'm sorry, I couldn't quite hear you. Say that again.
Oh.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. I made this up. This is not an existing thing. The point is that we're thinking of all of the atoms in your body, and I'm thinking like a physicist, so I do not care about the integrity of your body. I'm taking apart all the atoms and imagining all the different ways I could arrange them into configurations of various energies. Most of them would not be allowed to be a coherent metastable structure for very long because they're moving around too much, right? In order to settle into the configuration of a body that can get information and energy in from the outside world and stay alive, etc., there needs to be a way to lose energy into the environment. And that way is to give off photons. So this is just saying that there's specific energies at which the atoms in your body can be in the configuration of a body. More energy or less energy wouldn't work. So we need a way of searching through this space, and the answer is the ability to radiate photons.
Okay, last one, and then we'll go to the reception. Go ahead.
A simple question. As someone just starting out their career in physics, I'm learning so many great things, seeing out your research and hearing you talk. I would like to, engage in this type of research, but sometimes it's a little bit intimidating considering you have so much expertise and I'm just starting out. My question is, what's your advice to, as aspiring physics student that wants to become involved in research on this sort of stuff?
Good, it should be intimidating. We want to scare off people because it's so much fun to be a professional scientist that we can't just let anyone want to do it. No, it's no different than being a concert pianist or an NBA point guard or many other occupations that the number of people who would like to do it is much larger than the number of people who get to do it. It is hard in the sense that you need a lot of knowledge, but no one has that knowledge when they're born. Every scientist who is very successful learns things along the way. And you learn, to be a pianist, you got to play scales up and down over and over again. It's the most boring thing in the world, but it gets you that dexterity. To learn the physics that you need to be a professional physicist, there's a lot of grungy calculations you have to do. And in the middle of it, you're pulling an all-nighter to do a problem set that some of the people know what I'm talking about here. It can be kind of soul-crushing. Like, this is not what I signed up for. I wanted to think about this origin of the universe. I didn't want to, do an integral at 3 a.m. in the cafe. But you don't figure out the origin of the universe until you do a lot of integrals at 3 a.m. So I would just say the journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step. A lot of people have very successfully, I think that almost everyone has the capacity in them to learn what professional physicists know. It's up to you whether or not you want to stick through it, want to do the unpleasant parts of taking exams and staying up late, because the payoff is enormously big.
Thank you.
I think it's a wonderful spot to end. Let's thank Professor Carroll.
Thank you.